Texas summer 1944. The sun hammers down on barbed wire that cuts the horizon into neat, brutal lines. Beyond the fence, a line of men stands motionless, soldiers in faded Wehrmacht, grey eyes hollow from the Atlantic, crossing from surrender, from the sudden silence that follows defeat. They expect punishment, hard labour, rations of stale bread and watery soup, the kind that kept them barely alive at the front. Instead, the smell hits them first, charcoal sizzling fat sweetness in the air. American cooks stand over grills flipping thick steaks. Ice cream melts in metal tubs. They were handed steak and ice cream. These were men who had fought for Hitler's empire, now tasting the very comfort their propaganda had called decadent, weak, the rot of democracy. This is not a story of cruelty, but of contradiction. A story that left German prisoners asking one question that would haunt them for decades. Who really won the moral war? In this film, we uncover how thousands of German POWs in America were treated not with vengeance, but with kindness. Unexpected. It changed how they saw the enemy forever. Between 1942 and 1946, over 4,000,000 German prisoners of war were held on American soil. They came from North Africa, pulled from the wreckage of Rommel's Afrika Korps. They came from the beaches of Normandy soaked in blood and seawater. They came from the collapsing front lines of a Reich that had promised them victory and delivered only ash. Troop transports crossed the Atlantic in silence. Trains rolled through the Midwest carrying cargo that made small-town Americans stop and stare young men in enemy uniforms, faces pressed to windows, watching a country untouched by bombs. POWs glimpsed wheat fields that stretched forever, towns with lights still burning, children who didn't know hunger. Behind fences in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and the Deep South, they would wait out the war in a land that defied everything they'd been told. The United States faced a dilemma that cut deeper than strategy. How do you treat men who just months before were trying to kill your sons? Men who wore the eagle and swastika, who had marched under banners soaked in hate. Would vengeance rule or principle? The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment of prisoners. It was a document born from the last war's horrors, a fragile agreement that most nations signed but few honored when the blood was fresh. The United States, eager to prove its moral superiority against fascism, chose to enforce it meticulously. Not out of softness, but out of something harder, the belief that civilization meant something, even in war, especially in war. Rural America suddenly found itself hosting the enemy. Farmers who had sent their own boys overseas now watched German soldiers work their fields. Guards who had trained to kill now handed out baseball gloves and sheet music. The camps became strange mirrors reflecting back an America that prisoners couldn't reconcile with the monster their leaders had described. And inside those camps, behind wire and watchtowers, something unexpected began to happen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a slow, bewildering transformation. The kind that starts with a meal with a kindness so ordinary it becomes revolutionary. Late 1943. The trains pull into dusty depots where the prairie meets the sky in a seam of gold and blue. Camp Hearn, Texas. Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Camp Swift, sprawling across land that once grew cotton and cattle. The doors slide open and German POWs step down onto American soil, blinking in sunlight that feels different here, cleaner, somehow unfiltered by the smoke of burning cities. They brace for hatred, for the rage of mothers who lost sons, for the violence that prisoners expect from victors. Instead, they find curious townsfolk lingering at a distance, farmers leaning against pickup trucks, children pointing until their mothers pull them back. And everywhere that smell charcoal and meat, the unmistakable scent of abundance. The prisoners move in formation through gates topped with wire. US Army engineers have been busy. Barracks stand in neat rows, fresh lumber still pale in the sun. Mess halls large enough to feed hundreds, recreation yards. A building that will become a library, shelves waiting to be filled with books in German and English. One prisoner, a Luftwaffe radio operator from Bremen, will later write in his diary, "It looked like a summer camp for children, not a prison for enemies." The guards seem almost casual. They carry rifles, yes, but they also wave, offer cigarettes, speak in broken German that sounds more curious than cruel. The briefing they received was clear: treat them as soldiers, not criminals. The distinction matters. Criminals deserve punishment. Soldiers deserve respect even in captivity, especially in captivity, because that's what separates civilization from barbarism. For many of the captured men, this becomes their first encounter with a world untouched by total war. They come from cities reduced to rubble from a Germany where every able body had been conscripted, every scrap of metal melted down for tanks, every morsel of food rationed to the edge of starvation. They come from a place where the war had devoured everything: childhood certainty, the simple pleasure of a full stomach. Here, cities still stand. Lights burn all night without blackout curtains. Food is so plentiful that Americans throw some away. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. One sergeant from Munich, captured in Tunisia, stares at the horizon and sees no bomb craters, no skeletal buildings, no desperate faces. He sees cows grazing. He sees a tractor moving slowly through a field. He sees normalcy, and it breaks something in him that propaganda had built. The camp commanders establish routines quickly. Morning roll call, work assignments, male privileges censored but regular. The Geneva Convention becomes a manual they follow with almost religious precision because Washington understands something the prisoners don't yet. This treatment is a weapon more powerful than any bomb. It undermines every lie Berlin ever told. At night in the barracks, the prisoners whisper among themselves. Some remain defiant, clinging to ideology like a life raft. Others feel the first cracks forming in their certainty. They expected to be treated like the Untermensch their leaders described, subhuman, disposable, worthy only of contempt. Instead, they're given beds with mattresses, blankets that smell like soap, and the promise of 3 meals a day. The dissonance grows, it festers. It asks questions that propaganda can't answer. And then comes the first meal, the moment that will appear in letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies for decades. The moment when ideology meets abundance and hunger makes the choice for them. The mess hall at Camp Hearn stretches long and wide, windows open to let the Texas heat escape. Long tables, benches bolted to the floor. POWs file in with military precision, years of training keeping their backs straight, their eyes forward. They sit in disciplined silence, waiting for orders that never come. Instead, American cooks emerge from the kitchen, carrying trays, mountains of food that seem impossible, obscene even. Roast beef, thick sliced and glistening, mashed potatoes with butter pooling in the center, green beans, carrots, bread so white and soft it seems like cake, and dessert, actual dessert, not the sawdust cookies they choke down at the front, but pie pudding, sometimes fruit in heavy syrup. They stare at the plates. Some refuse to touch them, convinced it's a trick, a psychological game before the real punishment begins. Others whisper in rapid, "German, is it poisoned? Is it a test? Why would they feed us like this?" But hunger is a tyrant more powerful than fear. The first bites come tentatively, then desperately. Silence falls broken only by the sound of forks on metal trays, then impossibly laughter. Nervous at first, then genuine. A private from Stuttgart tastes butter for the first time in 2 years, and his eyes water. A corporal from the Eastern Front eats until his stomach hurts because he can't remember the last time fullness was possible. They look at each other with expressions that mix shame and wonder. Shame that they're grateful to their captors, wonder that captivity could taste like this. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs had to receive the same rations as US troops. It was a rule written on paper, rarely enforced in practice. But here in America, where farmland stretched beyond imagination and factories ran 3 shifts, abundance wasn't propaganda, it was reality. Even during rationing, even with sacrifice on the home front, American plenty was staggering to men who came from a continent eating itself alive. The diaries tell the story better than any official record. "We ate better in captivity than at the front," wrote a former Panzer crewman. "Better than we ever ate in the fatherland, even before the war." Another, a 20-year-old infantryman from Bavaria, "They gave us meat every day. Every day. In Germany, my mother was boiling shoe leather for soup. Here, the enemy gave us steak. The irony cuts both ways. Guards watch German prisoners gain weight while their own families back home deal with ration books. Some Americans resent it. Their boys are dying in Europe, while enemy soldiers eat 3 square meals. But the orders come from the top, and the reasoning is sound even if it feels wrong. Treat them well, and you undermine everything Hitler told them. Show them what democracy looks like, and you win the peace even while fighting the war. The prisoners begin to understand slowly that this isn't mercy in the soft sense. It's something harder, more deliberate. It's a demonstration. Every meal becomes evidence against the lies they'd swallowed. Every full plate whispers the same question. If America is weak and decadent, why do they have so much? If Germans are the master race, why are they the ones behind wire grateful for the enemy's charity? One mess hall conversation, overheard by a bilingual guard and recorded in camp reports. We were told they were starving, that their economy had collapsed, that they were desperate. But look at this. Look at what they throw away. We were lied to about everything. The realization spreads like infection passed in whispers between barracks, and with each meal, each unexpected kindness, the foundation of their ideology cracks a little more. The camps become strange little world slices of Europe fenced off within America's heartland. Inside the wire, a peculiar rhythm emerges, neither freedom nor punishment, but something in between. Men who once marched across North Africa now tend tomato plants in Oklahoma gardens. Former Luftwaffe mechanics repair tractors in Kansas. The war continues across the ocean, but here time moves differently, measured in work shifts and mail call, in concerts and carved wood. Under the Labor for Pay program, POWs work in agriculture and construction, filling gaps left by American men fighting overseas. They pick cotton in Texas heat that rivals anything the Sahara offered. They harvest wheat and vegetables, build roads, fell timber. The work is hard but fair, and at the end of each day, they earn 80 cents in camp scrip. Funny money that can't buy freedom but can purchase small dignities. Cigarettes, art supplies, writing paper, ice cream from the canteen. The canteen becomes a revelation unto itself. A prisoner can walk in with his day's wages and actually choose what to spend it on. Chocolate bars, Coca-Cola, that strange sweet drink that tastes like America distilled. Magazines, even some in German. The act of choosing, of exercising preference in captivity, creates a cognitive loop that twists their understanding of imprisonment. In the evenings, music drifts across the compounds. German orchestras form spontaneously instruments donated by churches and civic groups who can't quite explain their own generosity. Former members of Wehrmacht bands rehearse Beethoven in mess halls converted to concert spaces. They paint murals on barrack walls, Bavarian villages, the Rhine at sunset, scenes of home rendered in whatever paint the Americans can spare. Theatre groups stage productions of Goethe and Schiller. Language classes teach English to men who begin to wonder if they might stay after the war ends. Letters flow outward, censored but regular. Prisoners write home to families in cities that no longer exist, to wives picking through rubble, to children who've forgotten their fathers' faces. The letters are carefully coded, aware that both German and American censors will read every word. But between the lines, a message seeps through: I am alive, I am fed. The enemy is not what we were told. The guards too undergo their own transformation. Many are farm boys themselves, too young or too old for combat, assigned to watch men their own age who speak a different language but laugh at the same jokes. They play baseball with prisoners during recreation hours. They teach English phrases. They share cigarettes and photos of girlfriends finding common ground in homesickness and boredom. One guard from Iowa, interviewed decades later, remembered, "At first I hated them. My cousin died at Anzio. But then you're there every day, and you see them working hard, being polite, missing their families. You see them carving toys to send to their kids. You start thinking, these guys didn't start the war any more than I did. We're all just caught in it." For some prisoners, it becomes the first time they saw their captors, not as monsters from propaganda films, but as people. The same men who built radios from scavenged parts also fixed broken fences. They played baseball with the intensity of children and prayed before meals, with a sincerity that transcended language. They had mothers who worried sweethearts, who wrote letters, dreams that extended beyond conquest. The humanity becomes impossible to ignore, and humanity once acknowledged is nearly impossible to extinguish. In this strange liminal space between war and peace, between enemy and ally, something grows that neither side expected. Not friendship exactly, the wire still separates the rifles, still watch the war still rages, but understanding, recognition, the slow, uncomfortable realization that the face across the fence is a mirror. Inside the wire, another war is being fought, one without guns, but no less brutal. Two Germanys exist behind one fence, and the tension between them crackles like lightning before a storm. The hardline Nazi officers arrive with ideology intact, armor-plated against doubt. SS men, party officials, true believers who see surrender as temporary and victory as inevitable. They organize in the shadows, establishing hierarchies that mirror the Reich they left behind. Secret camp courts convene in latrines and supply sheds, tribunals that judge loyalty and punish deviation. A private court speaking English too enthusiastically might find his bunk ransacked, his letters destroyed. A corporal who questions the Führer's wisdom might disappear into the camp hospital with unexplained injuries. They enforce discipline through fear, the only currency they understand. Songs must be the right songs, Deutschland über alles, not American jazz. Conversations must maintain the proper contempt for the enemy. Anyone seen fraternizing too warmly with guards becomes suspect, marked as a traitor to the cause. In their minds, the war hasn't ended. It has merely paused, and when Germany rises again, and it will rise, it must rise, the collaborators will be remembered. But the common soldiers, the conscripts who never wanted ideology in the first place, begin to drift away from certainty. They're the teenagers who were pulled from farms and factories, given rifles and rhetoric, told that dying for the fatherland was the highest honor. Now, fed and safe, they start asking dangerous questions. If America is weak, why did we lose? If democracy is chaos, why does everything here work so well? If we're the master race, why are we the ones in cages? The divide widens with each passing month. Officers preach resistance and loyalty while eating the same generous meals, creating a hypocrisy that even the most indoctrinated can see. They rail against American decadence while wearing American-made boots, sleeping on American mattresses, reading books from American libraries. The contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Camp authorities notice the tension and act. They begin separating the radicals from the moderates, creating different compounds for different levels of belief. The hardcore Nazis go to camps with stricter security, less interaction with civilians, fewer privileges. The anti-Nazi prisoners, defectors, deserters, men who hated Hitler from the start, get transferred to camps where re-education programs run openly, where American values are taught alongside English lessons. In a cruel twist, freedom of thought exists more fully in captivity than it ever did in the Reich they served. A private can admit he never believed in the cause without fearing a bullet. A former Hitler youth can question what he was taught without his family being arrested. The camps become laboratories of deprogramming, not through force, but through simple exposure to an alternative. One prisoner, a former school teacher, conscripted in 1942, writes in his diary, "Here I can say that I think the war was wrong. I can say it out loud, and no one beats me, no one shoots me." In Germany, such words meant death. We called this place a prison, but perhaps we were more imprisoned before we ever arrived. The ideological war inside the camps grows bitter. Loyalists accuse moderates of being weak, corrupted by comfort, seduced by the enemy's lies. Moderates accuse loyalists of being blind, clinging to a fantasy while reality burns around them. Fistfights break out in barracks. Former comrades refuse to speak to each other. The unity that once defined them fractures along lines of belief. American authorities watch with clinical interest. They document the splits, study the psychology, learn how to accelerate the process. It's warfare of a different kind, not destroying the enemy, but transforming him, turning soldiers into citizens, true believers into skeptics. And slowly, inexorably, the balance tips. The steak tastes too good. The kindness feels too real. The propaganda rings too hollow when compared against lived experience. At first, there is fear. Farm wives lock their doors when transport trucks rumble past. Children are kept indoors when work details march through town. The enemy has come to Main Street America, and the presence feels like violation, like the war has reached backward across the ocean to touch soil that should have remained safe. But fear is exhausting to maintain, and curiosity is persistent. Rural Americans begin working alongside German POWs in cotton fields that stretch to the horizon, in canneries where tomatoes move down conveyor belts in rivers of red, in lumber camps where trees fall with thunderous crashes that echo through pine forests. The prisoners work hard. This surprises people. They follow instructions, show up on time, treat equipment with care. They don't complain, don't sabotage, don't match any of the images from war bond posters. A farmer in Oklahoma, desperate for harvest help with his son's overseas requests power labor, and receives a dozen Germans who pick cotton faster than any crew he's ever supervised. At day's end, he offers them water from his own canteen, a gesture that feels dangerous and right in equal measure. One of the prisoners thanks him in broken English. The farmer nods, unsure how to respond to politeness from the enemy. Children too young to sustain hate wave through chain-link fences. The prisoners wave back, sometimes producing hand-carved toys, little horses, wooden soldiers, figures whittled during evening hours, when memory becomes too heavy to bear. Mothers scold their children for accepting gifts from Germans, then quietly keep the toys on bedroom shelves, unable to destroy something made with such obvious care. Women sell pies through the fence, entrepreneurial spirits, finding market opportunities in captivity. Apple, cherry, pecan, homemade comfort, exchanged for camp scrip and grateful smiles. Some women lose sons or husbands overseas and still bake for the enemy, driven by something deeper than logic, a compulsion toward kindness that defies the hatred war demands. Guards, who initially maintained cold professionalism, begin teaching English phrases during slow shifts. They share cigarettes, compare photographs, discover that the German mechanic fixing the camp truck also worked on engines before the war, that the enemy sergeant, missing 2 fingers, lost them in a farming accident as a boy, not in battle. Common ground emerges in unexpected soil. The locals grow astonished that POWs greet them with respect, with please and thank you spoken carefully in accented English. They expected arrogance, the master race superiority the newsreels described. Instead, they find young men who seem grateful for small kindnesses, who work without complaint, who express shame when the subject of atrocities arises. One Texas woman, whose husband died at Normandy, volunteers at the camp library. She shelves books that German prisoners will read, organizes donations of German language materials, sits across tables where enemy soldiers study English grammar. When asked why, she says simply, hating them won't bring him back, and they're somebody's sons too. The exchange flows both ways. Prisoners learn American customs, taste foods they've never imagined, hear music that rewires their understanding of culture. Jazz, which propaganda called degenerate, sounds like freedom when it drifts from guards' radios. Baseball, incomprehensible at first, becomes a passion for men who discover that sports transcend language. Democracy, described as chaos and weakness, looks remarkably like cooperation when they watch town meetings through the fence, observe civilians disagreeing with officials without fear of arrest. Small acts of kindness accumulate into something larger than their individual parts. A farmer slips an extra apple into a work crew's lunch. A guard looks the other way when a prisoner keeps a carved chess piece that should have been contraband. A local church donates musical instruments and hymnals, recognizing that God speaks German too. They weren't what we'd been told, one Texan recalled, decades later, voice still carrying wonder. They were just boys who'd been lied to, just like our boys really, except they'd been lied to worse. 4th of July, 1944, Camp Hearn. Morning sun, already brutal heat rising in waves that blur the distant horizon. German POWs line up for morning formation, unaware that today will become a story they tell for the rest of their lives. A memory so vivid, it will outlast the war, outlast hatred, outlast everything, except gratitude. The mess hall doors open, and the smell hits them like a physical force. Grilled meat, charcoal smoke, something sweet and cold that shouldn't exist in Texas summer. They file inside expecting the usual, adequate, nourishing, nothing special. Instead, they find tables transformed, white tablecloths borrowed from town churches, paper decorations in red, white and blue. American flags alongside small banners, the prisoners made themselves careful recreations of state flags, unit insignias, anything except the swastika. And the food. Dear God, the food. Thick steaks grilled to order, juice running pink when knives cut through. Corn on the cob, butter melting in golden rivers. Mashed potatoes in mountains, fresh bread, salad with actual vegetables, crisp and green. And at the end of each table, metal tubs filled with ice cream, vanilla, chocolate, strawberry condensation beading on the containers like sweat. For the Germans, it is surreal. The same nation that bombs their cities into dust, that killed their brothers and friends, is now handing them steak and ice cream in honor of freedom. The same freedom they were sent to destroy. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. A psychological whiplash that leaves some men standing frozen trays in hand, unable to process the contradiction. A sergeant from Hamburg stares at his plate and begins to cry, not from sadness but from the sheer absurdity of it all. 6 months ago he was starving in a trench, eating rats and calling it protein. Now the enemy celebrates liberty by feeding him better than he ever ate in peacetime. The guards join them, not segregated, not watching from a distance, but sitting at the same tables, passing the same bowls. They toast with lemonade, Americans and Germans raising glasses together in a scene that would seem impossible anywhere else, any other time. Some guards share stories about Independence Day traditions, explain the history to prisoners who listen with genuine interest, trying to understand a revolution fought for principles rather than conquest. The ice cream becomes the detail that breaks them. It's unnecessary, frivolous, a luxury that makes no strategic sense. But that's exactly why it matters. The steak could be justified protein for working men. The vegetables provide nutrition. But ice cream is pure indulgence, a gift without purpose except pleasure. One private from the Rhineland, 19 years old, eats ice cream, slowly trying to make it last, and realizes he's tasting something he'd forgotten existed: joy. Simple, uncomplicated, divorced from ideology or duty. Just cold sweetness on a hot day shared with enemies who chose to be kind. They came to hate their own propaganda more than their captors. In diaries, in letters that censors read, and sometimes forwarded, to intelligence analysts, one phrase appears again and again, written in different hands, but expressing the same revelation. The Americans, they are not as we were told. The holiday meal becomes a turning point for many. You can hate an abstract enemy, a propaganda caricature, a symbol on a map. But you cannot easily hate someone who hands you ice cream on the 4th of July, who shares his nation's celebration with the men who tried to destroy it. That night in the barracks, the conversations shift. The hardcore loyalists still preach resistance, still insist that Germany will rise again. But their voices sound hollower, now competing against the memory of full bellies and unexpected kindness. Doubt spreads, like ink in water, quiet but irreversible. One prisoner writes in his diary, "They defeated us with bullets, but today they defeated us with ice cream. I don't know which cut deeper." The war ends in stages. First comes the news from the east. Berlin fallen, Hitler dead. The Reich collapsed into rubble and silence. Then the West surrenders, and suddenly the purpose of captivity evaporates. The prisoners are no longer enemies in waiting, but remnants of a nation that no longer exists, ghosts of an empire built on lies. But they cannot go home. Not yet. Europe is shattered, its infrastructure destroyed, its cities filled with refugees and corpses. The Allied powers debate what to do with millions of displaced Germans, soldiers and civilians alike, while the camps in America continue their strange routines. Men who expected liberation find themselves in extended captivity, neither prisoner nor free, waiting for a homeland that might not want them back. The work continues. The meals continue. The baseball games and concerts and English lessons continue. But now everything carries the weight of ending, of transition, of a future suddenly uncertain. Some prisoners receive letters from home, the first real contact in years. The news is devastating. Families dead in bombing raids. Cities reduced to skeletal frameworks. Starvation widespread. The economic collapse total. One man from Dresden reads that his entire street no longer exists, that his wife and children are living in a refugee camp, eating potato peels and grateful for them. He sits in a Texas mess hall surrounded by abundance, and the guilt becomes almost unbearable. Others receive no letters at all. The silence is worse than bad news because it leaves imagination to fill the void with horrors. In 1945 and 1946, the repatriation begins. Trains once again, but this time headed east. The prisoners board with mixed emotions, desperate to see home, terrified of what home has become. They leave America heavier than they arrived, healthier, carrying duffel bags filled with gifts and contraband. Cigarettes for trade, chocolate for children who've forgotten what candy tastes like. Letters of reference from American employers typed on official letterhead testimonials to good character from the enemy. The journey back is long and silent. They cross the Atlantic on the same ships that brought them, but the mood is different now. Coming west, they were defeated, angry, uncertain. Going east, they are changed in ways they cannot fully articulate. They've seen the other side of the propaganda lived inside the lie's inverse, and the experience has hollowed out their certainty. When they arrive in Germany, the contrast is immediate and brutal. American camps had barracks and beds and 3 meals daily. Germany has tent cities, breadlines, children with distended bellies. The prisoners step off trains into a wasteland that barely resembles the nation they left. The cities they remember are gone. The Reich that promised them glory has left them nothing but ash and shame. But they carry something back that authorities don't anticipate: stories. Stories of kindness from the enemy. Stories of ice cream and steak of guards who became something like friends of civilians, who treated them with dignity despite having every reason for hate. The stories spread through occupied Germany like sedition, undermining the narratives that hardliners try to maintain. Some write letters back to America, thank you notes addressed to guards, to farmers who employed them, to church ladies who donated books. The letters arrive in small-town mailboxes and cause confusion. Why is the enemy thanking us? But the gratitude is genuine, expressed in careful English or translated German words that try to explain how captivity became education, defeat became enlightenment. Others return to America as immigrants within a decade, sponsoring families, building lives in the country that once imprisoned them. They open businesses in Texas towns where they picked cotton. They marry American women they met through correspondence. They raise children who grow up calling both nations home. One former POW interviewed in the 1,980 seconds, grey-haired and prosperous, running a successful bakery in Oklahoma, said it simply: "They showed us what freedom looked like, not by lecturing, not by propaganda, but by living it in front of us every day. And we never forgot." Black and white photographs fade to color in museums and memorial exhibits. German veterans, old men, now visit former campsites decades after the war, walking grounds that memory has transformed from prison to sanctuary. They touch fence posts, still standing, peer into mess halls, converted to community centers, stand silent in spaces where their lives changed direction. In the end, the battle fought inside those fences was not of guns or ideology, but of humanity. While Europe burned, while millions died in camps that bore no resemblance to these Texas compounds, America offered its prisoners a mirror, showing them what decency under victory could look like, what restraint in power meant, what civilization required even when vengeance seemed justified. The choice was deliberate: feed them or starve them, treat them as soldiers or as animals, uphold principles or abandon them when they became inconvenient. Every meal, every kindness, every moment of dignity extended was a choice that said something about the nation, making it not about weakness, but about strength of a different kind. The war would end, borders would shift, empires would fall and rise. But the memory of steak and ice cream remained a symbol, not of indulgence, but of moral choice, of a nation that decided its values mattered even when, especially when they were difficult to maintain. Historians debate the strategic value question, whether kindness delayed repatriation, analyze the cost-benefit of generosity toward enemies. But for the men who lived it, the calculation was simpler and more profound. They came expecting hate and found humanity. They came believing lies and encountered truth. They came as enemies and left as something else, not quite friends, not quite allies, but witnesses to an alternative, ambassadors of a lesson learned through ice cream rather than ideology. The transformation was quiet, individual, impossible to quantify in military reports, but it was real. Slow, dissolve. An American flag ripples over Texas fields, where barracks once stood, where men who should have been enemies discovered they were merely human. Archival photographs flicker past, smiling POWs at picnic tables, guards and prisoners playing cards, a baseball game frozen in summer light. In the mathematics of war, kindness rarely counts. Historians measure victories in territory gained, casualties, inflicted, resources destroyed. But sometimes, in the margins of those calculations, something happens that rewrites the equation entirely. German soldiers came expecting hate. They found humanity, and in that moment between steak and ice cream, something quietly profound occurred. The enemy stopped being the enemy. Not through force, not through propaganda, but through the simple revolutionary act of treating human beings like human beings, even when everything said you didn't have to. War changes men. It hardens them, breaks them, reshapes them into instruments of violence and survival. But kindness changes history.